Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? Some have argued that smartphones have become a necessary part of everyday life. But if that's the case, then where do smartwatches fit in? So smartwatches, as we'll be talking about this time around, are a relatively new category of technology. Of course, we've had electronic watches for quite a while. Everything from simple battery-operated watches to ones that have little miniature calculators built in, like those classic ones from the 80s. But in terms of what watches and smart devices and wearable technology has been able to do, there haven't been very many good examples between, say, those calculator watches and now. There hasn't been a major push. So this is really a fairly new category. I wouldn't necessarily consider it an extension of anything that's come prior. Now, like any new tech, when smartwatches first emerged just a few years ago, I was really interested because it seemed like a novel concept in some ways, but also a major extension of other things that we had been seeing before, just this continued push into miniaturization. And when you think about it at kind of a macro level, it's amazing what they're able to do in a smartwatch these days, what they're just able to pack in and have the device be capable of. But at the same time, when I saw all these products start to launch, I became kind of skeptical. Not necessarily about whether the technology would actually work, no doubt it would, but rather about how practical or useful a smartwatch would actually be beyond the initial kind of wow factor that you would get from, say, the first few days of wearing it. I wasn't necessarily convinced that on a longer term scale, it would really live up. Now, reading the reactions from others and hearing their experiences and everything, well, that's one thing, but it's something completely different to experience all of that on your own. So I finally broke down relatively recently and decided, you know what, the prices have gotten to a point that I'm comfortable with. I'm going to go ahead and pick one up, just if for no other reason than to experience it myself, to really figure out what this whole thing is about. I had seen more and more people start to wear smartwatches, and I figured, well, you know, if you've got pretty good uptake on it, then there must be something compelling behind it to get people to want to buy it. So I finally went out and I bought a watch, and I bought an Apple Watch Series 1. I bought it on sale, which was perhaps one of the major drivers as to why I even bothered to pick it up, because it wasn't going to be that big of an investment. Now, why did I go with an Apple Watch versus any of the other smartwatches on the market? Well, one, I'm an iPhone user, and that was the most logical choice to pair with it. I certainly would have been willing to try another smartwatch if it had the same level of interactivity with an iPhone that an Apple Watch would. But at the same time, I also picked the Apple Watch because it's kind of become the clear leader in its space. Not to say that other watches don't work well, but in terms of pushing functionality and features and being just a really good example of what this market is capable of, it's become kind of clear that Apple is really out at the front. So I figure if I'm going to really determine what this whole market segment is about, well, I might as well go with what the most popular item is. So long story short, you can go ahead and call me an Apple fanboy, whatever, if you want. I resisted buying an Apple Watch for a very long time. If I was a true Apple fanboy, I should have been out lining up in front of the Apple store day one when the watch first launched. I didn't. I intentionally didn't because I didn't feel like there was a need to. So I went with an Apple Watch now simply because, well, I think it's probably the best choice. So let's get into the overall experience. The first thing that I noticed is that unboxing the device and initially getting into it, it's the typical Apple, experience where it's very well manufactured, very well presented. But in turning it on and really getting going with it, I actually found a fairly un-Apple-like experience, and that it is somewhat complicated to set up. You have to pair the watch to your phone, but all the setup really gets done on the phone. The watch has fairly limited controls on it, so that actually kind of makes sense, and we'll be getting back to that in just a little bit. But you basically have to set everything up on the phone, and then the phone pushes all those settings to the watch. But translating one to the other doesn't necessarily make a whole ton of logical sense, right? You're seeing a UI on the phone representing, all these options you can set on the watch, but they don't necessarily reflect what it actually ends up being like on the watch. I mean, you can get screenshots, that sort of thing, but as you're rolling through all these menus, there's a lot of processing in your head that you have to do to figure out, okay, well, it's talking about this aspect of the watch, and it's a, do you want this turned on, or what do you want this to look like kind of a thing. We're so trained and used to making the changes directly on the device that we're trying to make a change on and instantly seeing what that change looks like, that it's kind of a jarring experience going the other way, where you have to make the changes on a different device and then execute those changes and then look to see, like on the watch, oh, that's what the watch face actually looks like. Well, I don't like that. Let me change it. And you have to go back to the other device. So to sum that bit up, it's a little bit cumbersome and complicated to set these watches up. So that was a little off-putting at first. It actually felt like a somewhat non-Apple type of experience. The other thing, like I was talking about with limited controls, is yeah, these have a touchscreen on them. Pretty much all the smartwatches that are on the market that I've seen, at least around the same price point, they've all got, touchscreens on them. But they've also all got fairly limited other controls. Some sort of scroll wheel type devices typically present on Apple Watch. It's the digital crown, and others I've seen where like a ring around the face can spin around, some other stuff like that. And then maybe you'll get an extra button or two on the side that you can press to do other certain functions. Now, we're so used to using touchscreens as the primary mode of interaction with a device that's going to be your go-to. But that's not necessarily going to be the best way to interact with a smartwatch simply because of how small the touchscreen is. I mean, on a smartphone, it makes sense because the screen is physically bigger and there's room within the user interface for software developers to, be able to accommodate. If you need to touch on a certain point of screen to, say, toggle a setting or execute an action, it's big enough so that you can touch it with your finger. On a smartwatch, your finger relative to the size of the screen is much bigger. There's less places where you could put buttons on a touchscreen that's on a smartwatch, or be able to interact with the items on screen, to be able to scroll around, anything like that. So getting used to a different way of interacting with the device was also a little jarring. My natural reaction was to want to scroll up and down, left and right on the screen with my finger. In some places on the watch you can do that, but in others, your finger gets in the way, and it makes more sense to start scrolling with the wheel on the side. But it's this, wait a minute, how do I scroll? Oh, that's right, I have to do this other function kind of thing that keeps tending to catch me by surprise every time I use the watch, even though I've had this thing for about a month now. So there's definitely a bit of a learning curve to getting into a smartwatch and really understanding how to be useful with it, how to be productive with it, just how to work the thing, considering how different it is than a smartphone, which was perhaps the biggest thing that caught me by surprise. You figure, well, the smartwatch, it's just going to be a smaller smartphone strapped to your wrist, right? In many ways, it's a very different thing. So the other thing that I've noticed that's actually relatively positive is I figured a smartwatch would be a bit heavier, a bit bulkier, maybe a bit thicker, a bit larger, simply because of the tech that they tried to pack into it. But what I noticed is that my Apple Watch is actually lighter weight than the mechanical watch that I was wearing before it. And even more interesting, it's slightly thinner. So it's a bit more unobtrusive. And I've got the 42 millimeter Apple Watch, which is the bigger of the two sizes. And it seems to be kind of the average size of the other smartwatches that are on the market. So that's a notable positive about this. You would think that, well, maybe, the first few years of smartwatches will be these big bulky things. No, that's one thing that they seem to have gotten right, kind of right off the bat, is not making them be like ridiculously big. They seem to be keeping wearability and comfort in mind towards the top of the list and not sacrificing those for whiz-bang features. So I was definitely very happy to see that. So I don't really have any problems wearing this on a daily basis. Whereas if it was bigger or heavier, I probably wouldn't wear it so often. Another thing though, of course, the flip side of that small size and relative lightweight is going to be a compromise on battery life. I'm used to wearing a mechanical watch, which doesn't even have a battery in it. As long as the watch moves around every once in a while, like walking around or something like that, it keeps itself wound. Obviously, that's not the case with a smartwatch. You have to plug it in and charge it. For my own use, I'm getting a full day out of the battery. Now, that said, I'm not actually using the watch a ton, and that's something we'll get back to in a bit. But other people have found that they basically make about a day's worth of use out of the watch, if not slightly less. And that's going to be fairly universal, I think, across all the makes and models of true smartwatches, simply because of what they're trying to do and the level of connectivity that they have. The problem with the relatively limited battery life is, one, yeah, it's going to be kind of annoying for your users. For some people like me, you could just get into the habit of, well, at the end of the day, when you put your phone on the charger, we'll just put your watch on the charger too. But what watches can offer in terms of features and functionality go beyond just a typical, 8 or 10 or 12 hour day that we have when we're awake. So having an 8 or 10 or 12 hour battery really kind of cuts out some of the functionality that you could otherwise have with a smartwatch. That's another major facet to the watch we'll talk about, but it's something to keep in mind that it's not necessarily you can wear it for 2 or 3 days straight and get full use out of it in all these different aspects, and then only periodically have to stick it on to charge. You're going to be charging it every day, and you have to carry all the stuff with you to charge it every day, because of course it's going to use a different charging cable or method than, say, maybe your phone does. So that's just more stuff. If you go traveling, you travel a lot or whatever, it's just more kind of baggage you got to carry with you. Whereas if it was a short trip, if the battery lasted longer, you could probably get away with not needing that. Now, no doubt battery life is only going to get better as time goes on with smartwatches, so this will hopefully become a moot point. But battery life has stayed about the same on smartwatches for the last few years, so it's going to take a little while, I think, for us to really get there. But here's a good example as to why I wish the battery on this lasted longer, at least for my own use case. And that is, these work really well as alarm clocks. Now, I'm still kind of a traditionalist, and I have a real alarm clock by my bed, and it just turns the radio on or whatever when it's time for me to wake up. But sometimes you don't want to necessarily disturb anyone else around you when you set an alarm like that. So let's say you have to get up extra early to go into work, and you don't want to wake up your significant other or your spouse or whatever with your traditional alarm clock going off. Well, the watch, if you set it to vibrate mode, works really, really well to wake you up unobtrusively. I've actually tried it. The problem is your battery going to last long enough through the night to even have the watch still be powered on by the time that it's supposed to wake you up? That, again, is part of the limitation of the battery. So it's like, if you want to use the watch to wake you up at a certain time in the morning, it's almost like you have to not wear the watch during the day previously so you could charge it up. And then, are you going to have enough battery when you do wake up in the watch to get you through the following day? They're really just built around kind of your typical you're awake now type of cycle, so it can charge at night. So it put some unfortunate and artificial limitations on the functionality just because of the relatively limited battery life. So what about it as an actual usable device? I mean, that's the hardware aspect to it. Overall, the hardware quality on a lot of these smartwatches seems to be really good, but if the hardware is good, that isn't necessarily the complete picture. What about it as an actual useful device? Well, standalone, I don't find it to be terribly useful. Yeah, you can do some stuff on it, on its own. Like there's a small amount of memory in a lot of these smartwatches where you can load some music or an audiobook or something like that. Most of these will have Bluetooth connectivity that you can pair headphones directly to. So if you want to go out and say go for a run or a walk or whatever, and you don't want to carry any other technology with you, you don't want to have your phone on you, anything like that, yeah, you've got a little bit of capability there, so you can just listen to music or something like that. But most of the watches that are being sold need to tether to another device through Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. Only in this latest crop of smartwatches that we've seen has started to include cell radio functionality into them. Now, even with the cell radio, they're still somewhat limited in what they can do, but if you've got that constant tether of the watch needing to be nearby your phone, yeah, that lets the watch be more useful than it would be on its own, but it also raises the question as to why you even need the watch to begin with. So here's a great use case for how I've at least been interacting with my Apple Watch. It's really good, I've found, for notifications or quick interactions. Things like getting incoming calls or text messages or maybe even emails. Just like seeing, okay, the phone's ringing. Do I want to answer it? No, that's a telemarketer or whatever. That's really quick and easy. Same thing with a text message. Hey, is something going on? A real quick message that's quick to read on the smartwatch screen, and it can be quick to reply. Emails, obviously, that's going to be a one-way only kind of a thing. You're not going to compose an email on a smartwatch, but if it's a relatively short message, yeah, you can get away with scrolling through it. The problem is trying to reply. So, like I said, with emails, emails tend to be longer form media, so you're probably not going to want to try and tap out some kind of reply on a watch. You're almost always going to be going towards your phone. Text messages on these smartwatches can be hit or miss depending on what you want to say. If you just need to send back a canned response, like, yeah, that's okay, or no thanks, or talk to you later, or whatever, that can be a good option for the watch because most of those common ones are going to be built in. You can just simply tap the one you want, send, and off you go. Takes a couple of seconds and you're done. But if you need to actually answer a question or respond with more meaningful information, that's where the smartwatch kind of starts to fall down. Yeah, on Apple Watches and I think some of the other ones, they've got this like handwriting recognition kind of stuff. Apple calls it Scribble. I have not found Scribble to be terribly accurate. In fact, it reminds me of the old school graffiti handwriting recognition from Palm Pilot devices, if you're old enough to remember those. Yeah. It's tedious and it's cumbersome, and within a few seconds, you're just like, you know what, where's my phone? I'm going to reply using that because that's a lot faster and easier. And because the watch pretty much needs to have your phone there, that becomes your natural reaction. So what I've found myself getting to the point of is simply using the watch to screen incoming notifications to figure out, do I need to respond? And if I do, then I just go over to my phone. Now, that could work well for some people, but not for others. But it also raises the question of, well, do you really need a watch to do that? Like, how busy are you during your day where you need the benefit of being to just quickly screen stuff? Hey, your watch starts vibrating. You can look at it real quick. Oh, I don't want to answer that call right now. Or, oh, I don't want to deal with that text message right now, or whatever. When you've got your phone right there. I don't think there are going to be that many people who legit would save a ton of time not having to pull their phone out of their pocket every time they got a notification and just looking at the watch instead. So in terms of like practicality, usability from a communication standpoint, I would say it's kind of a nice to have, but definitely not a need. What about other apps? What about other functionality? Well, strangely enough, it seems like the list of apps is actually dwindling. And some of that, I suspect, is due to lack of adoption. Most of the apps that are on the smartwatch devices are really just extensions of their same apps on the smartphone. So a good example is Shazam, which I have loaded on my Apple Watch because I'm occasionally out and hear a song that sounds interesting and I want to figure out what it is. I tried it not too long ago on the Apple Watch, and it's the same experience. You tap on the app and it wants to listen, but it actually takes longer than on the phone because it needs to listen and record that audio, then send it to the phone. The phone can then process it and figure out what song it is, and then come back and notify you what it was on the watch. Now, it's nice that it's a seamless experience and that I can go back to the phone later and look at all the lists of songs that I've, had it look up for me in a single place. But what takes 30 seconds on the watch takes about 10 seconds on the phone. And so I've learned that, in most cases, I'm just going to reach for my phone when I need to use that app. There are some other kind of more niche case uses that the watch can be nice to have, but sometimes could even look potentially pretentious. One is going to be contactless payments. I think we're all used to seeing NFC payments on smartphones now. Android Pay, Apple Pay, Samsung Pay, all the other derivatives that we've got now. They're really cool, and I'm a big fan of those because, one, there's enhanced security, and two, it just lets you have to carry less stuff. And watches are starting to get on that bandwagon too, where the watches will have NFC built in, and if they're paired to your phone, then you can use your watch to make the payment. But again, it's that whole if they're paired to your phone and your phone is nearby thing. What I found is it's actually easier to use Apple Pay on the phone than it is on the watch, because with the phone, all you have to do is hold it up to the reader, and if the phone's unlocked, or in the case of an iPhone 10, it sees your face, you've got your finger on the Touch ID sensor. It's really easy to see on the screen as you're trying to place the transaction whether it's reading correctly or not, and it's very quick to do so. The few times that I've tried to pay for something with my Apple Watch, it's been a little more cumbersome, where you have to tap the button on the side of the watch a couple times to actually even just let it know, hey, try to do Apple Pay. But you have to put the face of the watch against the reader, which means you can't see it. So it becomes a little bit of a fumble to try and get the watch lined up on the reader correctly. You don't get any visual confirmation that you're close or doing it right. You basically just have to kind of wave your arm around in front of the credit card terminal until the watch vibrates and beeps to let you know that it was successful. Whereas with the phone, it's faster and easier, and I think you look like less of a dork, less pretentious. I mean, it's one thing to see people wearing these smartwatches. They kind of blend in. They're not so ostentatious. But if you're waving this thing around like, ooh, look, I can pay with the palm, the wave of my hand, like, I don't know, it just kind of rubs me the wrong way, and I never really felt all that comfortable doing it. I'd rather pull my phone out and do it that way, simply because most people these days have phones that are capable of doing that. So you don't feel like you're, rubbing it in someone's face that you've got a watch and they don't, or something like that. Again, not that these are terribly expensive, but still, I don't know. And I think that kind of leads us maybe into the next section is, so if these smartwatches are only somewhat useful in terms of productivity, then what other function do they really serve? Well, if you go back to the initial launch of the Apple Watch, and some of the other smartphone, kind of tethered watches are the same way, they also made a major push towards fashion with these, figuring, well, watches in general have been fashionable for quite a while. I mean, there are a number of brands of watches that go for just tons and tons of money. Rolex is the biggest one. People spend just ridiculous amounts of money on like fancy looking watches. So the smartwatch industry figured, well, hey, we can get in on that too, right? So we started to see these really expensive smartwatches launch, and Apple was perhaps one of the better known ones again. And you could, for a while there, spec an Apple Watch out to be tens of thousands of dollars, to the point where you really, had to have crazy money to want to buy that. Like, you didn't necessarily buy it because you wanted it as an Apple Watch. You just wanted it as that fashion statement. Now, what's interesting, you would think that would have just gone gangbusters, but it actually seems to have pulled back. And I think a lot of it is because of the realization that, you buy a Rolex and it's going to be good for decades, right? You may need to periodically get it maintained or whatever, that's fine, but a mechanical watch isn't necessarily going to become obsolete. Like 30 years from now, we still will need to know what time it is. So you see all of these vintage and current watches, like non-smartwatches, they still go for good amounts of money as fashion statements because they become kind of timeless. Apple Watches and other smartwatches will never be timeless. In a few years, they're going to become obsolete, just like your phone and any other piece of technology. So I think maybe one thing that's kept people from wanting to get into the smartwatch as fashion bandwagon, maybe excluding those people who were crazy enough to pay tens of thousands for the really expensive ones, but I'm talking more about maybe the people who would spend $500 to $600 on like a higher tier of smartwatch. In terms of Apple Watch, maybe going from the aluminum ones to looking at the stainless steel ones or something like that, is simply the realization that, in 3 or 4 years, this thing's going to be sitting in a drawer anyway. Do I really want to spend that kind of money on something that's going to be that relatively short-lived? I think if you're going from a fashion standpoint, take that money and invest it in something that's going to be a little bit more timeless. So we've seen the market respond to that, and now the most expensive Apple Watch that I can find on Apple's website is, in quotes only, $1,400. So it's come down considerably from the tens of thousands that it once was. Now, that's not to say that a cottage industry hasn't propped up to produce fancy watch bands and stuff like that. And maybe that's the better way to approach it if you're looking at smartwatch as fashion, is just go into the accessories realm instead of the watch itself. I mean, under the hood, the watches are all the same really anyway. But I do think the net benefit from the lack of perception or reduced perception of smartwatches as fashion is that it's become more acceptable and accessible to the general public. In just the last year, I've seen way more people out and about wearing smartwatches. A lot of them Apple Watches, but a lot of them other smartwatches too. And I think if we had gone more down the road of, well, it's just a fashionable thing and you have to buy an expensive one, well, then I don't think nearly as many people would adopt them. So it has, I think, had a net benefit where if we don't think of these as being that fashionable, if we simply think of them as being as fashionable, in quotes, as, say, a smartphone, well, then we're all better off. And yeah, you're going to have some people with nicer smartwatches than other people, but that gap between normal smartwatch and expensive smartwatch is much narrower now than it used to be. But, as fashion, there's no practical perspective there. But if smartwatches are also not that good in terms of productivity, do they really have any redeeming value at all? And that gets us to the one thing that smartwatches do very, very well, and is actually the new frontier for them, where I see the most attention getting paid in their development, and that is fitness tracking and overall health tracking. That was something that really was brought in as part of the smartwatch from the beginning, but it's only just exploded since then in just the last few years. So it's not so much just like being able to track your steps and when you're actually being active. The whole appeal to smartwatches is that they can track your entire day. They can track you when you're not active. They can get better idea about what you actually do during the day and make suggestions for you about how you can improve your lifestyle and your health to try and get you to be more active, to try and get you to sit down less, that sort of thing. And that's the big difference I feel between smartwatches and another similar parallel to them, and that are these fitness tracking wearable devices. Companies like Fitbit and Garmin, they produce definitely less expensive devices that you can wear, and they'll tell you like how far you've walked or ran or whatever. But a lot of those at the lower price points are really just kind of glorified pedometers. I mean, some of them have some basic notification capability built in where, yeah, you do pair them to your phone, and if a text message comes through, it can give you some kind of indication. But a lot of these devices have hardly even any buttons on them, and they really rely on the companion app that you put on your phone to even get any data out of them. So that's really the big difference, is where smartwatches, because they've got a bigger screen and better processing power and better connectivity in them, is that they can really look at your whole day and try to not just track what you do, but encourage you. So things like reminders. Hey, it's been an hour since you last stood up. Why don't you stand up for 10 minutes or something like that? Hey, you said you wanted to walk 3 miles today and you've only walked 2. Why don't you go ahead and, do some more now, or something like that. Being able to tune all of the notifications and all the tracking for specific exercises that you do. It's not just a pedometer thing. Sometimes you got people who are really more into lifting weights or into swimming or into biking or anything like that. Some of the other fitness trackers really kind of fall down when it comes to doing or tracking those types of activities, yet those are things that smartwatches can actually do pretty well. And even if you look at the hardware on smartwatches, what have been some of the biggest advances that we've seen in smartwatches? Well, the two that come to mind, at least when it comes to the Apple Watch, is adding true waterproofing, as in you can submerge the thing, and then also adding GPS. I don't care if I can submerge my watch if all I needed to do is tell me if I have a text message coming in. Same thing with GPS. But as a fitness tracking device, that gives me a lot more flexibility. If I can submerge it, that means I can go for a swim with it. If it does GPS, that means I don't necessarily have to carry my phone with me. Plus, it'll give me better statistics out of what my exercise actually was. Now, I don't actually really use my own Apple Watch for exercise and fitness tracking. I'm fine doing my own thing. But I think the fitness tracking has actually been the biggest draw towards smartwatches. It's people who want to get better data, better statistics, and sometimes maybe even just that encouragement and reminder from their device as part of an overall initiative that they have to try and get more healthy. And I think that's a really, really good thing. I think that's perhaps the biggest frontier for smartwatches and where they can go. And then also getting into other aspects of health, not just looking at are you fit, but are you healthy otherwise? Being able to figure out potentially down the road what your blood pressure is, what your blood glucose is. These are all things that are in development. Being able to tell you non-invasively just by looking at the screen on your watch, oh, if you're diabetic, hey, these are your numbers, you may want to adjust something. Or, hey, your blood pressure is high or your blood pressure is low, or any other kind of health indicators that something may be wrong that you can get and track more consistently than just going to the doctor periodically. Anything along those lines. So along in that realm, you might want to think that, well, say Apple is competing with Samsung in terms of smartwatches, something like that. I don't think that's the case at all. I don't really think that the Android watches and Apple watches are necessarily competing with each other simply because they're so locked into their own platforms' ecosystems. I don't really potentially see that there's going to be a huge demand for, well, I've got an iPhone, but I want to use it with this Android watch, or vice versa. It's generally going to be well, if you have an Android phone, you're going to buy an Android watch. If you have an Apple phone, you're going to buy an Apple Watch, that kind of thing. Where I think the smartphone manufacturers are actually competing with are against those fitness trackers, because the fitness trackers keep getting better. In fact, some of the fitness tracking companies are trying to get into smartwatch territory, which I do view as a good thing because it means competition. Competition is always good, and competition always drives innovation and gives better options for consumers. Consumers win when there's competition. So having Apple be so far out in front in terms of what its watches can do compared to, say, everybody else, depending on the aspect of the watch that you're looking at, that's great for Apple, but it's not necessarily great for everybody else. So to see that, say, Fitbit is getting more and more into the true smartwatch kind of category is really exciting. But that's really who the mainstream smartwatch makers so far are actually competing against. They're trying to get people who would otherwise go out and buy that $100 Fitbit that just does basic fitness tracking, trying to get them to spend the extra bit of money to step up to a true smartwatch. And then they're using all the whiz-bang features like notifications and being able to play music off of it and turn it into a speakerphone and all that. That's really just the icing on the cake. Those aren't necessarily the upfront, real compelling features for, I think, most people who are considering a smartwatch. Anyway, I think I've rambled on long enough about this topic. It's surprising that I could even ramble long enough about this topic, considering just how relatively new this industry is. But I think that just goes to show what potential there is to it. I don't think it's ever going to be constrained at just what it is now and it'll die out. Wearables are definitely going to be here for quite a long time. And I think it's really exciting to see just where they can go and what real benefits they can actually have. Maybe they're not terribly beneficial in a lot of ways right now, but I suspect in the years to come that will dramatically change. So, with all that said, I'm of course curious as to your thoughts. Do you own a smartwatch? What do you have? Do you have one of the Android watches? Do you have an Apple Watch? Or do you have a fitness tracker? Are you a diehard Fitbit or Garmin fanatic, something like that? Why did you pick the one that you have? If you don't have one, why not? Are you intentionally staying away from them like I did for quite a while? I'm just curious as to your thoughts, so be sure to leave them down in the comments below. Also, if you're interested in audio-only versions of these podcasts, I have them available as plain MP3 downloads over on my Patreon page. Supporters get access to them at all contribution levels, so as little as $1 a month gets you in. It's just a little thing that I like to offer as a thank you for people who want to support my work on Patreon. It offers custom RSS feeds so you can throw them into your podcast player of choice. And these typically do go up a few days before they show up here on YouTube. So that's all just something to consider. Anyway, if you like this one, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching. Watching? Get it? Yeah. I know it's not funny.